Brian, many people feel that the only way you can know God is to sort of feel God, to have the experience, religious experience, etc. Without discussing that, are there ways that metaphysics, the deep use of analytic philosophy, can really help us to discern what God is all about?
I think so. Metaphysics tries to study the way things are in a very abstract, general way. Sometimes, in working on a metaphysical problem, you find that a certain role needs to be played, and that role starts to look a bit godlike. One person who found this was Alfred North Whitehead, an English metaphysician from the beginning of the last century. Whitehead had the view that all of reality just consists of experiences. We needn't talk about that for now. But he also had the thought that there were Platonic ideal forms of things. For example, there was an ideal beauty, an ideal truth, that numbers were somehow ideal objects. Now, you've got the view that there are these ideal objects, and you've got the view that everything there is nothing but experiences. And let's say he had arguments for both those things. Well, to put those things together, what you need is an experience where all those ideal objects are going to be there. And since they're Platonic ideal objects, they're going to be there eternally. So you need an eternal experience. Simplicity dictates getting by with just one of them. So you've got one eternal experience in which all the Platonic ideals are just there. That is starting to look very much like what St. Augustine understood God to be. And so Whitehead, proceeding just by giving a general metaphysical description of things, wound up isolating a role for God to play. I myself have done something somewhat similar. I've looked into the nature of possibility and necessity, and I've asked, well, what is it that makes things possible? A good general answer for that is that what makes something possible is that there be a power able to bring it about. Why was it possible that I exist? Because my parents had the power to beget me, and so on. That seems like a good answer to that question. Well, then if you're going to generalize that answer, apply it to every possibility, you're going to need powers able to bring about every possibility. Well, guess what? That's just what omnipotence is supposed to contain, power enough for that.
So your analysis begins with the general features of the world. There are possibilities. And then infers and develops an argument that seems to require something like a God as you proceed along the process.
Right.
And let me go back to your premise, though. Is it a necessity that a possibility requires something to actualize it in order to make it a possibility? It doesn't seem so.
Certainly, a lot of possibilities are like that. For example, the possibility that I exist, every physical possibility, the possibility of any given universe. There are also, however, mathematical possibilities. It's possible that 1 equals 1, but we don't think, of course it's true, so therefore it's possible. But we don't think there had to be a power able to bring that about to make that possible. Well, there are two ways you can look at that. One is that there is sort of a presupposition for it to be true that 1 equals 1. It's not true that Santa Claus equals Santa Claus because there is no Santa Claus. Nothing has the property of being identical with Santa Claus. So neither would it be true that anything had the property of being identical with the number 1 if there were no number 1. So you can ask the question, well, did there have to be a power to bring something like the number 1 into existence? On a lot of conceptions of numbers, you would need that. Now, the other way you could go about this, okay, so one thing is you could need a power able to bring numbers into existence. The other way to look at it is this. Well, some things are possible because there are powers to bring them about. Other things are impossible because there's no power to bring them about. So it's impossible that 1 not equal 1, right? So there's no power able to bring that about. And so within an overall metaphysical scheme that says for every possibility you've got to be talking about powers somehow, you can say that some things are possibilities for which there are powers that could bring them about. Other things are true and possible because there is no such thing as a power able to cause them not to be the case.
Okay, so if we assume that, can we then go to the next stage and look to metaphysics to help us understand what this being may be like?
Some things are necessarily the case because there is no such thing as a power to make them not the case. If they're necessarily the case, they're actually the case. And so, for example, it's necessary that 1 equal 1, so it's true that 1 equal 1.
Okay, let's now go to the next stage. Can we use metaphysics not just to suggest that such a perfect being as God may exist, but to try to discern what that being, if that being exists, is like.
Perfect being theology is a metaphysical procedure. And so if you can do that, certainly you can use metaphysics to characterize God. You can also read some characterizations of God out of the metaphysical argument you give that sort of pushes you toward his existence. For example, if God is really going to be the ground of all possibility, he's going to be the ground of every possible world. And from that, you can get pretty readily to the conclusion that God must exist necessarily. He's got to be there in every possible world if he's the ground of every possible world. I can spell that out a bit more, but maybe you can see it on an intuitive level anyway. If he exists necessarily, he's going to exist eternally, since he can't not exist. If he exists necessarily, he's going to be an immaterial thing, because no material object exists necessarily.
Okay, so this is good, because now that you have God necessarily existing, you're now being able to rigorously define other properties which may not have been obvious to begin with, but are directly derivative, are logical conclusions of God being a necessity.
Right.
So one is God existing eternally, and one is that God cannot be material.
Right.
Okay, any others?
From necessity, I think those are the main ones you can get with a very strong argument. There are some people who think that the only sort of non-material object there could be would be a person of some sort. I don't know if that's true. Some people find it a plausible thought. So in addition to the strict deductive arguments you could give from God's necessity, there's sort of an argument of plausibility. The plausibility argument would say, well, look, given that he's immaterial, it's plausible that he'd be a personal being.
That argument would seem to have a number of gaps.
Absolutely. That's why it's only a plausible argument.
So integrating it all together, what can metaphysics tell us about God?
Metaphysics can tell us that God plays certain basic roles in what you might call the economy of reality. In my particular metaphysics, it can tell us that God exists necessarily. And from that, you can derive that he exists eternally and immaterially, which are pretty strong conclusions derived on a purely philosophical basis.